Hello, and welcome to Truly Terrifying. This channel is dedicated to bringing you the best true horror stories the world has to offer. If you like scary stories, please stick around, subscribe, and tickle that bell for notifications of when we post new videos. In this episode, we will be having 10 true haunted house stories. Let me start by saying, this wasn't my house, it was my friend's. When I was around 9 years old, my best friend lived in the local manor house. It was a big house that was built sometime in the early 1800s. His father was a psychiatrist who specialised in the treatment of addiction. He had bought the manor to use as an alcohol rehabilitation centre. The family lived on the top floor of the manor, and the residents lived on the lower levels. My mother also worked in the clinic, so as you can imagine, I spent a lot of time there. It really was a great place to play and spend your days as a kid. Games of hide and seek could last hours on end, and the grounds of the house left endless possibilities for games and dens. I never found the house scary despite its age and many dark corners. It was like a magic castle that I was free to play in. That all changed one night when my friend invited me for a sleepover. I was the kind of kid who didn't usually do sleepovers. I liked my own bed and room, and always found it difficult to sleep in strange surroundings. In fact, I still do. Even now, if I stay in a hotel or go on holiday, it takes me a long time to get to sleep. However, back then I felt it was time I made the effort to stay at a friend's house. And the idea of the fun we could have in the house and grounds at night made it an appealing idea. The night went as expected, playing in the grounds and woodlands until we couldn't see our hands in front of our faces, then going back to the house and eating junk food and watching trashy movies. Eventually his mother told us it was time for bed. I was to sleep in a bed in his and his younger brother's room. Of course, after getting to bed we carried on talking for hours. At some point my friend and his brother were fast asleep. I, of course, was not. I spent what felt like hours tossing and turning, trying to settle down to sleep. Of course, sleep would not come. I heard his older brother and parents moving around and watching TV. Eventually I heard them all going to bed. Then I was alone in the darkness and silence in this old house. At some point I needed to go to the toilet. The bathroom was situated over the other side of their apartment and meant walking down a long corridor. I looked at the clock and saw it was now 2 a.m. For the first time ever, I felt nervous in this house. Night had transformed my magic castle into something creepy. I edged along the corridor towards the light that had been left on in the bathroom. I made it there and did what I had to. Returning to the room, I chastised myself for the fear I had felt on the way to the bathroom. That was until I got back into my friend's room. When I opened the door, there was a woman in a long grey dress with her hair up in a tight bun standing between my friend and his brother's bed, looking down on them as they slept. She was as solid as you or I, but she seemed devoid of colour, like a black and white photo had come to life. I gasped. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. She heard the noise and looked straight at me. Despite her appearance, her eyes were full of kindness. She put a finger up to her lip and then motioned towards the bed I was using. Without taking my eyes from hers, I crossed the room to my bed, slowly, giving her a wide berth. Once I was in bed, she smiled and turned and walked out the room. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night. When I told my friend the next day, he assumed that I had been dreaming, but I know I had no sleep at all that night. I never stayed there overnight again. Years later, we found out that in the early 1900s, my friend's room had been the nursery, and that a kind nanny had died in the house. I guessed that she was still doing her job and watching over the children of the house. My house is haunted. I moved in 6 months ago after changing city for work. I felt lucky to have found a beautiful little turn-of-the-century house that was well within my budget. Sure, it was small, but it was just me and I thought it was perfect. The first few weeks in the house were great as I took my time decorating and arranging my furniture. The antiques that had seemed so out of place in my old apartment fit perfectly in this house. Though my job was in the city, the house was in a small rural community on the outskirts. My parents came over to see the house and stay a few days so my dad could help me with some of the more difficult jobs. He said he was concerned about a young woman living all alone in the house that was so secluded. The house was the last one on the road. It was shaded by trees to the front, and the rear backed onto a field that led to some significant woodland. He thought that this made the house a target for burglars, or worse. I thought he was being overprotective as usual, but I agreed to let him pay to have an alarm system and security cameras fitted, more for his peace of mind than my own. Once the security system was fitted was when the strange happenings started. The first incident was I came home from work. It was now late September and it was starting to get dark when I got home. After a busy shift, I was absolutely beat. I grabbed something to eat quickly and checked my emails, then decided to go and watch TV in bed until I drifted off. I locked up and set the alarm, then headed upstairs. I must have passed out asleep pretty quick, because I was fast asleep at 9:30 p.m. when I was awakened by an unfamiliar screeching tone. It took me a few moments to realise that it was the alarm. Fear gripped me as I thought someone could be in the house. My phone rang, giving me a small heart attack. It was the security company. They were checking to see if it was a false alarm, or if I needed assistance. I told them that I had been asleep when the alarm went off. They told me to stay where I was and they would check the footage. They came back saying that it was inconclusive. They said the footage showed a window opening slightly, but it was too dark to see who had opened it. They assumed that the sound of the alarm had scared off whoever it was, but they would send a security officer just to check. I waited in my bedroom until I heard the officer knock on the door. I let him in and he shut off the alarm for me and proceeded to check the house and surrounding area thoroughly. When he returned, he said there was no one still hanging around. He showed me the footage from the camera outside the window. You could see the window raise, but it was almost as if it was raising on its own. He agreed that it was weird, but due to all the shadows from the trees, if someone was dressed dark enough, it might obscure them from view. I thanked him and he reset the alarm for me. Still on edge, I went back to bed and watched TV until the early hours of the morning when I finally got to sleep. That was the first in a series of strange events. Though the alarm was not tripped again, it seemed like every week there was some strange occurrence. It was about a week or so after the alarm incident when all of my circuit breakers kept tripping out. I called in an electrician who could find no reason for this to be happening. He said that although the house was old, the wiring had obviously been replaced not long before I bought the place, and it had been done well. After his visit, the tripping stopped. Not long after that, I was having a few days off work. I went out for the day to go hunting for some more antiques. When I got home, I found all of the drawers in my dresser were open. Nothing was missing. Nothing looked like it had been moved, and no other cupboard in the house had been opened. I called the security company to ask if my alarm had been triggered while I was out, and they said no. It was around this time that part of my mind was starting to put these events together and was beginning to lean towards a supernatural explanation. However, as a scientist, I was trying to push that thought from my mind. I could no longer pretend a few nights later. A friend of mine had come over and we were having a few glasses of wine downstairs when we heard loud thudding footsteps upstairs. It was as if a large guy wearing boots was walking between my bedroom and the guest room. We grabbed a knife each from the kitchen and went up the stairs to investigate. There was no one up there. My friend said, "I think your house is haunted." At that moment, the bedroom door slammed shut. We screamed and, of course, ran downstairs. I've never been into this kind of thing and had no idea what to do. Luckily, my friend who was there had some knowledge. She suggested that I went from room to room, saying firmly that this was now my house, and though I accepted that they were there, the spirits had to stop scaring me. With wine for courage, I did this. After I had finished in every room in the house, I went back downstairs and said, "Do we have an understanding?" At that moment, all the lights in the house blinked on and off. Since that night, I have had small incidents, like things moving around the house or soft footsteps on the stairs, but nothing as major as those early incidents. I had an imaginary friend when I was young, or at least everyone thought he was imaginary at first. It all started when I was about 4 years old. My father got a job working for the National Trust. For those who don't know what that is, it's an organisation here in the UK that looks after heritage sites and stately homes. My father's job was live-in caretaker. The house was an old 15th century manor house in the West Midlands. The house was open to visitors at the weekends and a few days during the week in the summer months. We had a small but functional apartment within one wing of the house. My dad's job was general maintenance and upkeep. The visitors were by and large respectful, and so this wasn't a hard job for him at all. Though we were not allowed to touch things that were cordoned off, we were allowed to wander the house when it was closed, and I spent a lot of time playing in the Great Hall. This was basically a large empty room with dark wood floors and dark wood panelling. It was a large space for a 4-year-old to run around in, especially if the weather stopped me from going outside. Apparently one day, after we had lived there for a little while, my mother called me up for my dinner in the apartment. I went on to explain that I'd been playing a game of Tig with a boy named Nathaniel. I said he was really fast and hard to catch. My mother paid little attention. I was a young child, and at that point, an only child. It was completely natural that I would have imaginary friends. From that day on, I would play with Nathaniel on pretty much a daily basis. I have vague memories of this, and in these memories, he seems as real as anyone I ever met. My parents just played along. If I asked if Nathaniel could come and play in my room, they would say yes and greet him. They offered him food when I asked if he could stay for dinner, although he didn't ever want any. As far as they were concerned, I would grow out of it. At Christmas, I asked if Santa would bring a present for Nathaniel. My parents asked me what he wanted. I told them he wanted a toy boat like the one his father sailed in. Sure enough, on Christmas morning, there was a present marked for Nathaniel. He asked me to open it, and I still remember how happy he was when he saw the boat. He asked if we could go sail it in the pond. I asked my father. To that, he looked shocked, saying there was no pond in the grounds. Nathaniel told me that there was. We all went outside, and I followed Nathaniel to a patch of sunken ground off in the far tree-covered corner of the gardens. My dad said that it looked like there had been a pond there once, but it had been filled in a long time ago. It was then that I noticed my mum giving Dad a strange look. Obviously, she wondered how I could possibly have known that there was ever a pond there. It was around this time that my parents began to ask me more questions about Nathaniel. I explained that he was 6 years old, taller than me, very thin, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. They asked me about what he wore, and I said he wore these strange long shorts and long socks. I later discovered that these were breeches and stockings, and he had shoes with buckles on them. My parents then seemed to avoid talking about Nathaniel for a while. One day, though, we had a few visitors in, so Mum and I were up in our apartment, and Dad was fixing something when an old lady asked him who the little boy was playing in the Great Hall. My father said he was annoyed at first, thinking that my mum had let me down there to play while the house was open to the public. He asked the old lady, "What boy?" She said he was about 6 or 7, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. He was also dressed in 17th century costume. My family had lived in this house for years. We were happy there. Nothing unusual had ever happened there, and none of us had ever considered that it may be haunted. Things changed when I turned 15. Up until that, my parents had had one bedroom, my sister another, and me and my brother had shared the third room. It was decided, though, that as I was getting older, I deserved more space. We couldn't afford to move at that point, so my dad decided that he would renovate the basement and create a bedroom down there for me. He did a great job. I had a large bedroom, a den, and a bathroom down there. It meant I could have friends over, and we could do whatever we wanted without disturbing the rest of the family. Seriously, I only had to go upstairs for food. My first night down there, I was super excited. I'd got an old chair and a futon down there in the den, along with my TV, PlayStation and hi-fi. I watched a few movies before bed, and then went to bed. Once I was in bed, I realised how little light the small windows let in. My basement bedroom was much darker than my old room. However, I liked it as dark as possible to sleep, so this pleased me and I fell into a sound sleep. I was awoken by a scratching noise in the corner of my room. I looked at my watch and saw it was nearly 3 a.m. I grabbed the torch that I kept on my nightstand and switched it on. As soon as the beam hit the corner of the room, the scratching stopped. There was literally nothing there. I decided to get up and go to the toilet. While I was in there, I heard scratching again. This time it was coming from the den. I went to investigate, but again, once the light went on, the sound stopped. I was tired and the noise didn't bother me too much, so I went back to bed. The next day I told my parents, and my dad said he would put some traps down there. While he was renovating, he hadn't seen any evidence of rats or mice, but he guessed that was probably the source of the scratching. A few days later it was the weekend and I had a couple of friends staying over. We were hanging out in the den watching movies and stuff. One of my friends went off to the bathroom. A few minutes later we heard him loudly saying, "Very funny, guys." We had no idea what he was talking about. We were just about to get up and go and see, when he came back looking confused. He asked us how we'd got back so fast. He didn't believe us when we told him that we hadn't moved since he left the room. It turns out that as he was about to come back out of the bathroom, he felt the door get pulled away from him and held shut. We figured that the door had got stuck and he had just made up the stuff about the door being pulled closed from him. Later that night though, we were all crashed out in the den when I woke up and saw a silhouette coming down the hall from the bathroom. I figured it was one of my friends until I looked and saw they were both asleep on the floor. I tapped one of them awake. He looked up and saw the silhouette. He asked if it was my dad. I said no. There was no way he could have got down the creaky basement steps without waking us. The figure went into my room. We watched for what felt like hours, and the figure never came out. Eventually, built up the bravery to go and investigate. We grabbed my baseball bat and headed down the hall to my room. There was no one in there. After that night, my friends wouldn't stay over anymore. I told my parents. They said I must have been dreaming, even though 2 of us saw it. Most nights from then on, I saw the shadow figure, sometimes just crossing a room in the corner of my eye, or other times standing in doorways. I also experienced a feeling of being held in the bathroom, like my friend. The atmosphere in the basement at night felt really heavy and threatening. My schoolwork began to suffer, partly due to lack of sleep and partly due to the depression I was slipping into. I barely ate. I was withdrawn and aggressive towards my siblings and disrespectful to my parents. They took me to a therapist who tried to get me to talk through my problems, but whenever I started to explain what was happening in that basement, she would try and unpack the meaning of it as though I was imagining it. One day my mom went down there to get my laundry. I had not bothered bringing it up for a while. While she was down there, she heard the scratching I had encountered on my first night. She was ready to tell my father that the traps had not worked when she stepped out into the hall and came face to face with the shadow figure. She said it felt like she couldn't breathe. She felt malevolence radiating from this entity and finally understood what was wrong with me. After that, my parents got a priest to come over and bless the basement. After that, the atmosphere changed. It no longer felt oppressive down there, and I never saw the shadow figure again. I stayed in that basement room until I went to college. I moved into a new flat after I broke up with my husband. There was just me and my daughter, who was 3 at the time. It was a simple council flat just out of the centre of a market town on the east coast of England. The flat was in a pretty bad state when I moved in. The previous tenant had been an old man living on his own, who clearly hadn't bothered decorating for several decades. It was clean enough, but the whole place needed a complete makeover. Luckily, I loved decorating, so I got stuck in with paint and wallpaper straight away. After it was ready, I moved my daughter into her new room. She loved it. The first night in there, she fell asleep really quickly. Early the next morning, though, she crawled into my bed, still sleepy-eyed. I asked what was wrong, and she said the toys wouldn't stop playing. I laughed to myself, guessing she had just got up and played with them before coming into my room. When I got up myself, I found every toy out of her toy box, every teddy off the shelf or bed. Everything was just scattered across the floor. I was so annoyed. After how amazing the room had looked just the night before, I reminded myself that she was only 3 and going through a lot of upheaval. I asked her to put the toys back in the box, and she said that wasn't fair. I asked her why not, and she told me that it wasn't fair that she had to put them away when she didn't get them out. I laughed to myself and asked who did then. She said they got out by themselves. This seemed like a typical 3-year-old excuse, so I just helped her put them away. Then we went about our day. The following morning followed the previous exactly. Early morning, she climbed into my bed. When I got up, the toys were all over the floor again. Again, I asked her to put them away. Again, she complained and denied it. This happened every day that week. When her dad came to pick her up for the weekend, I asked him to talk to her about it. He said he would. That night, I relaxed at home alone. I watched TV, ate junk food, and drank some wine. I went to bed and allowed myself a little lie-in the following morning. When I did get up, I felt sad. I missed my daughter, so as I passed her room, I opened the door just to remind myself of her. To my horror, the toys were all over the floor. They had not been when my daughter left. I know that I had not emptied the toys all over the floor. So now I know that my daughter and I are sharing our flat with a toy-obsessed poltergeist. My family were driven out of our last home by ghosts. The house was old, at least 100 years. In the time we lived there, we experienced an endless amount of paranormal activity. There were constant banging and footsteps, things going missing, and things being thrown around. Some of the more sinister activity included an occasional screaming that would come from the attic. It would last for about 2 minutes and then stop. It would usually happen in the middle of the night and wake everyone up. One day, my mum was making dinner in the kitchen. She was chopping some veg and turned away to do something else, leaving the knife on the side. When she turned back, it was no longer there. She looked on the floor and all around the kitchen and couldn't see it anywhere. Confused but busy, she got another knife out and carried on chopping. It was around then that I came into the room. I looked up and asked Mum why the knife was stuck in the ceiling. She looked up and actually screamed. The knife that she had been using was now embedded in the ceiling right above her head. If it had fallen, it could easily have killed her. Another time, my younger brother started crying in the middle of the night. His sobs were so loud that me and my parents ran into him. He was panting for breath, his face was red, and he was drenched in sweat. Once he calmed down, he said that he had woken up and there had been an ugly old woman stood over him. She had put her hand over his mouth and nose, and he had been unable to breathe. When he heard all of us running to his room, she had simply vanished. One day, I had just stepped onto the stairs when I felt 2 hands in my lower back shove me. I fell all the way to the bottom and actually broke my arm. It was soon after that the final straw came. Everyone was already on edge, when one night we were all in bed when the screaming started again in the attic. This time it didn't stop. It was accompanied by pounding footsteps running all over the house, doors slamming, lights flashing on and off. My dad said enough was enough. He got us all in the car and we drove to a nearby hotel. We stayed there a few nights. I never went back to that house. My father went back to pack all of our possessions. We moved in with my grandparents until we found a new house. I heard that about 10 years after that, the house, which had been uninhabited at the time, burnt to the ground. I can't say that I'm sorry it's gone. When we moved into our farmhouse, we believed we had inherited a cat. The back door had a cat flap in it, and most days we would see a grey tabby walk through the room or run up the stairs. Sometimes we would see it lazing in the sunlight streaming through the windows. However, if we ever tried to pet it, the cat would jump up and run away. We put food down for the cat, but it never ate it. My dad assumed that it was eating the mice and other small creatures it found around the farm, and therefore wasn't hungry. We supposed that the cat just needed time to get used to us. However, a month or so later and things were still the same. If we went near the cat, it would run off. I tried following it once. It ran up the stairs and ran into my parents' room. When I got in the room, I could not find the cat anywhere. I told my parents this and they said that cats are quick and agile creatures, so it probably just managed to get around me without me noticing. I thought this was probably true. After a few more weeks of buying cat food and the cat not eating and never letting us near it, my dad was getting annoyed and decided to remove the cat flap from the back door. He thought if the cat just wants to be a farm cat, then it can stay outside. The rest of us thought this was a little mean, but we were also getting annoyed at the cat's aloofness. For a few days we did not see the cat. Then, I came down the stairs to see it stretched out in a patch of sunlight cast from the glass panel in the door. It looked up at me, and as I began to descend the stairs, it ran off towards the kitchen. When I rushed after it, I reached the kitchen. It was gone. My mum was in there. I asked her if she had seen the cat run through. She said, yes, it just went out the cat flap. I looked at her for a moment before what she had said dawned on her. She swore she had seen the cat run through the door, out of the corner of her eye. We rushed to tell my dad what had happened. He was a bit of a skeptic, so he said that it was in her peripheral vision. Mum must have not noticed it turn away and go somewhere else at the last second. We turned the house upside down looking for the cat to prove Dad wrong. It was nowhere to be found. A few days later, from nowhere, it just strolled across the living room. The sightings of the cat continued. One day, my father bumped into the old owner in the village and just happened to mention that he had left his cat when he moved. Apparently the other man laughed and said, "Oh, you met Trixie then?" Dad said that we had, but that the animal wouldn't eat or let any of us anywhere near it. She wouldn't us either, not after the accident. Accident? My father said. What accident? The man told him. Trixie was run over and killed 20 years ago. Let me start by explaining that I have never considered myself to be psychic in any way. I have also never believed in the supernatural. I love a scary story as much as the next person, but to me that was all they were, stories. That was until the voices started. My boyfriend and I had just moved into a new apartment. It was a loft conversion in the city. We were told it had once been a clothing factory until the 70s. Then it had basically been a warehouse until it was converted into residential units in the 90s. We moved in 2017. We were so excited with being from small towns, we had often dreamed of living the sort of lifestyle we had seen in movies and TV shows. We both had good jobs and decided it was time to follow that dream. The apartment we found was on the 4th floor of the building. It was a studio loft with open-plan kitchen, diner and lounge area, and then 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. It wasn't huge, but to us it was perfect. A few weeks after we moved in, it was a really hot night. I woke up drenched in sweat and in desperate need of water. My boyfriend was sleeping soundly, so I quietly crept out of the bedroom and made my way down to the kitchen and got myself a glass of water. As I stood there drinking, I heard whispered voices. At first, I thought it must be coming from down in the street. With the heat, we had all the windows on open lock. However, the more I listened, it didn't sound right. Sound from outside carries differently at night, I know that, but these were whispers. If someone was whispering 4 floors below, I wouldn't be able to hear them up here. It also didn't sound muffled at all, like it was coming from another apartment, or in the hallway outside. It sounded like it was in our apartment. It seemed to be coming from the lounge area. Now, as anyone who's ever lived in an inner city loft with large windows knows, even when your lights are off, the street lights illuminate well enough that you're able to see clearly. There was no one there that I could see. I began to question whether it was my imagination when all of a sudden I heard a sentence from the conversation that chilled me to the bone. Clearly, one of the voices said my name, followed by the words, "is watching us." Nope, I thought to myself and ran back to the bedroom and shook my boyfriend awake. I frantically tried to explain to him what had happened. Obviously, in his half-asleep state, he found it hard to follow, but when I said in the apartment, he leapt from the bed and grabbed the golf club that he kept in our bedroom for home security. He rushed out into the lounge, waving the club and shouting for whoever it was to get out. He turned on all the lights and searched the apartment and checked the door. It was locked, bolted, and the chain was on. "There's no one here," he said. "I know," I replied. He looked at me confused. So once again I explained what had happened, that I'd got up for a drink and heard people whispering in our apartment, even though I could clearly see that no one was there, and that they knew my name. He told me that I was probably half asleep and heard voices from outside, or a neighbour's TV, and my brain made these weird connections. I told him that I knew the voices had been in the apartment and said my name. We were both tired and had work the next day, so rather than argue, we decided to just forget about it. My boyfriend usually got home from work before me, except on Thursdays when he had to work late, until around 9 p.m. The Thursday after the first incident, I got home at my usual time of 6:30 p.m, had a shower, then I watched some TV until about 8 p.m, when I decided to start making our supper so that it was ready for when my boyfriend got home. As I got the ingredients together, I began to hear the whispers again. I looked around. There was of course no one there. The TV was off, and again these voices seemed to be coming from the lounge area. It was hard to tell, but I made out at least 3 separate voices, though at first I couldn't make out the specifics of the conversation. From the tone, I could definitely hear what sounded like a young woman, an older woman, and a man, all of them chattering and interrupting each other. It reminded me of the way that my colleagues would gossip around the water cooler at work. "I don't like her," I made out from the younger woman's voice. "Stuck-up bitch," I heard the old woman say. "What shall we do?" asked the man. Then there was nothing I could make out for a while. I began to feel uncomfortable. Even though my eyes told me there was no one there, I could sense that I wasn't alone, plus my paranoia was starting to tell me they were talking about me. I told myself that was crazy. How could I possibly know they were talking about me? "Look at her," the old woman said. "That's not how you chop tomatoes, you stupid bitch." I dropped the knife I was holding and gasped. I was chopping tomatoes. They were talking about me. I ran into the bedroom and hid in there sobbing until my boyfriend came home. I was worried. I knew full well that auditory hallucinations and feelings of persecution were signs of schizophrenia. Was I losing my mind? Just as me and my boyfriend had got our lives on the track we had always dreamed of, was I falling apart? When my boyfriend got home, he comforted me until I explained what had happened. I told him my concerns that I was losing my mind. He reassured me that I was the sanest person he knew. He said that we would go and get an appointment to see a doctor if I was worried, and he would stand by me no matter what. This made me feel a little better, but I began to dread being alone in the apartment. I would meet my boyfriend at work on Thursdays and come back with him rather than come back on my own. I did go and see a doctor who said that I wasn't schizophrenic and that maybe it was the stress of the change of lifestyle that was causing my anxiety, and that in turn was causing me to imagine the voices. The doctor thought that once I had fully adjusted to life in the city, I would be back to my normal self and no more voices. The news that I wasn't suffering from a serious mental illness made me relax a little, and for the next few weeks I did not hear the voices again. One day I came home from work. I opened the door and walked in to find my boyfriend looking as white as a sheet. I asked him what was wrong. My first thought was that he had received some bad news from back home, maybe a death in the family or something. "They're real," he said, looking at me wide-eyed. I was feeling so much better the past few weeks that I didn't get the meaning straight away. "Who's real?" I asked. "The voices," he said. "I heard them. They know our names. They don't like us." Apparently not long after he had got home from work, he had been in the bathroom when he thought he heard someone talking. He assumed that it was me and I'd come home early. But when he got out of the bathroom, he realised he was the only one in the apartment. He said that he had just put it down to hearing a voice from outside or a neighbour, and that my stories had just got into his head. However, once he sat on the couch, he heard the voices again. He said that this time they were right next to him, like the people were stood at the end of the couch. They talked about how much of a bitch I was and what a pussy he was, and how they wished we were dead. I felt a strange mix of emotions as he told me this story. On the one hand, vindication that the voices were not in my head, but also absolute terror that they were real and that they hated us so much. Soon after, we made the decision to give up on the city lifestyle dream and move back to our small hometown. I still don't know who or what those voices were, but I pray I never hear them again. I was about the age of 13 when this story took place. I lived in an old house just on the outside of a large city and was surrounded by cornfields and forests. I had lived there all of my life before this happened. It was a dreary summer night, which is mostly normal for the place I live, but on this particular night something just felt off. I'd come home from soccer practice around 6 p.m, and my parents always had me in bed by 8. The night went on as usual. I ate dinner, played with my little sister, and did some weightlifting before bed. I got into bed around 7:45. This story will better make sense if I tell you some things about me. I'm a restless sleeper. I toss and turn and get up periodically through the night, and I've always had a fascination with the afterlife. Okay, back to the story. I'm not exactly sure what time I fell asleep, but I didn't really have any of my usual episodes. This was the first night I slept peacefully in years. I was suddenly awoken by a strange noise coming from the bathroom in my bedroom. Since I had to use the bathroom anyways, I decided to go in and check it out. I thought it might be a mouse or a bat since we live in the country and the house is old and has holes in some of the older walls. I went in the bathroom and I didn't see anything, so I proceeded on my way to pee. After peeing, I washed my hands and face, and when I was washing my face, I looked up at the large mirror that overhangs my sink. Since there was still water in my eyes, my vision was blurry and I couldn't really see much, but I thought I saw something behind me. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I dried my face off and looked up at the mirror again. Right behind me, there was a little girl, clutching my body, almost as if she was hiding from something. Her ghostly outline scared me at first, but as I kept looking, I could tell that whatever was scaring her was coming from the basement. So I walked to my basement door and I opened it slightly at first, because I was very scared of what might be behind it. This being said, I've lived in this house my entire life and have never been in the basement. My dad had once mentioned something about there being 3 separate parts, all separated by small windows that you could barely fit through. So I walked down the basement steps and got down to the bottom where the light switch was. I turned it on. All seemed like it was okay. That's until I heard what sounded like crying from one of the other parts of the basement. In my mind I was thinking, fuck this shit, but in my heart I knew I had to see what it was. So I ventured through to that part of the basement, and the light couldn't reach the other side where the other room was. It was pitch black. I heard the crying, but since it was so dark I couldn't see anything. Something gave me the urge to go to the far corner of the room, because the way the moonlight reflects off the floor, you could kind of see with the little light you had. I walked over to the corner and stared directly in the middle of the room. There, in the middle of the room, was a chair. It had shackles for the feet and what looked like some type of restraint for arms or something. That's when I noticed that there was someone sitting in the chair. I walked closer, only to reveal that it was the same little girl ghost that had been crying previously in the bathroom. She was also crying there and had needles stuck in her arms, draining some type of fluid into her. All was quiet till she started screaming. It was so high-pitched I thought it sounded like a siren or something of that nature. She was saying words, but I couldn't make out anything she was saying until she spoke 5 menacing words that made my heart sink. She said, "Get out, Daddy is coming." Not even thinking twice, I sprinted up the basement stairs, tripping over my own feet, and fell flat on my face once I reached the top. I got back up and ran to my parents' room. I told them what happened. They went down there and checked everything out. I told them about the chair and the little girl that was screaming. They told me that there was no chair in the basement and that there had never been 3 parts of the basement. Me not believing them, I walked back down there, and the room that I saw the chair in was not there. There's only ever been 2 parts of the basement, my dad said. I told him what I saw and how I knew there had to be some mistake, but I never did see that part of the basement again. I'm 18 now, and I decided to do some research on the house to see if there's any history that could have caused that. I came across an article about a man who had been arrested in 1868 for doing lab experiments on all of his children. After the man was arrested, the police found all 12 skeletons of his children stuffed behind the basement stairs, under debris and concrete. Now that I finally have moved out of that house, and that finally I have an answer as to what I saw that night, I'm finally at peace. But those 5 words still hang over me to this day. Get out, Daddy is coming. My sister Penny was always afraid of the upstairs at our house. She never went up there at night. Our main conversations every night went something like this. Penny: "Buffy, go upstairs and find my white sweater, black jeans and leather jacket." The clothing items would change from night to night, but I was always asked to get her things. But she would not go up without an adult after dark. Me: "Why can't you go get them?" Penny: "Because something is up there." Me: "I sleep up there, nothing has happened to me." Penny: "Just wait, someday it will." Okay, I'll admit it's creepy as hell up there. I will give you the layout. There are 2 rooms that lead into each other, no hallway, and there is an attic above, and one on each side. The house is well over 100 years old, and there is a banister over the stairs, but it is closed off by a door. I remember Penny coming home from dates, and before she would take her boyfriend upstairs, she would send him up with a flashlight to check the closets and under the beds, even though I was in one of those beds. Once, when our mother asked why she would not sleep upstairs in her room, she rattled off numerous reasons. You can see small lights come out of the closet, and you can hear footsteps and heavy breathing in the attics, and there is always a sense of being watched a little too closely. I used to say, "That's ridiculous, I've never seen anything or heard anything. You should stop letting her sleep on the couch every night, Mum." My mother would say, "She's okay, she can sleep where she wants. She's not hurting anything." I think my mum knew, but since nothing was bothering me at the time, she overlooked it. Better to have 1 daughter on the couch than 2. I even took this problem to my dad, being as he was always on my side, and Mum seemed that she was always on Penny's side. Eventually, my sister got married and moved out when she was 18 and I was 11. Then I guess the ghost or whatever thought it was my turn. My experiences. The attics, I would hear stomping, and it was not in just one attic, it was all three. There were whispers in the closet, like two children having a conversation. The conversations I overheard were from talking about dolls. Sometimes they were trying to figure out what had happened to someone named Uncle Doffy, and sometimes it sounded as if they were discussing how they could run away. I did not get a bad feeling from the girls in the closet. I was always being watched all day and all night and lived in a constant state of panic. When I was upstairs, every nerve was on edge. The worst thing was this big black shadow in the middle of the night asking where Penny was. The voice wasn't the voice of a kid. It sounded like it came from someone who smoked 4 packs a day for 50 years. The black shadow asked after my sister 6 times every night. When I would not answer out of fear, the shadow would throw things at me. Books, figurines, even pictures. Then it was my turn to sleep on the couch, and then I understood my sister. It wasn't an excuse. She had actually heard these things. I never understood why I didn't until after Penny moved out, and I was bullied by this ghost or whatever it was. But what this entity was a bully, something that always had to have power over the young, powerless sisters that lived in the home. Fast forward 2 years after Penny was gone. She had her own home. My oldest sister couldn't afford the house she was renting due to being in the middle of a divorce. She brought her 3 kids and moved in with us. Jennifer, who was 5, Kevin, who was 3, and Amanda, who was 2, which meant Jennifer would be staying with me, and we were both expected to sleep upstairs. We were woken up all the time by stomping, and when Jennifer would start to cry from being scared, I would tell her it was because the house was old, and that's what old homes did. They settled at night, exactly what my mum had always told me when I heard odd noises in our home. Jennifer's 6th birthday rolls around, and my mother buys her one of those creepy clown dolls, you know, the ones with a plastic head and a wire body under its clown clothes, and has the most insanely evil laugh. That clown was always going off by itself at night, never during the day. One night I decided I had had enough, so I got out of bed and went over to take the batteries out, but when I opened the battery pack, no batteries were inside. I told my mum and older sister, but no one cared, or they thought it was an overactive imagination. Penny believed me. So the next day I got up and threw it in the attic, but it would still go off in the middle of the night. Then one day I came home and the doll was out of the attic and sitting on the chair across from my bed. When I asked who put it there, no one knew. We ended up burning that doll. Penny came and burned sage in our home. Now that I'm grown up, my kids like to stay with my mom. They always tell me about their things being moved and their chargers being jerked from the wall. But I still feel that it waits to this day for Penny to come home. Maybe because she feared it the most, I don't know. But I know that the bully brought me a lot closer to the sister whom I couldn't possibly live without now. Well, thank you for listening to those 10 true haunted house stories. If you enjoyed them, please subscribe and tickle that bell icon so that you can be notified about our next videos. Stay scared.